"Ma'am, security has been called. Please leave immediately." Those words cut through the laughter at Ethan Parker's 7th birthday party like a sudden drop in temperature. In the middle of a sunlit mansion in Beverly Hills, California, where gold balloons floated near crystal chandeliers and a string quartet played softly in the background, Margaret Collins stood completely still, holding a small wrapped gift in her hands. She was 65 years old, dressed modestly in a simple navy dress she had worn to church earlier that morning, unaware that within minutes she would become the center of a humiliation she never imagined possible. Around her, guests slowly turned their heads, their smiles fading into uncertain silence as 2 security guards stepped closer, guided by a single gesture from Jessica Parker, her daughter-in-law. Jessica stood near the main dining table, perfectly composed, her designer dress flawless, her expression calm but cold in a way that made the air feel heavier. This was supposed to be a celebration, a day filled with balloons, cake, and children's laughter, yet something unspoken had been building beneath the surface long before the first guest arrived. Margaret had come early that morning, carrying homemade cookies she baked herself and a small gift for her grandson, Ethan, wrapped carefully in silver paper. She had always believed that showing up meant love, that family gatherings were sacred spaces where generations connected without condition. But from the moment she entered the mansion, she noticed the subtle shifts, brief glances that lingered too long, conversations that paused when she walked by, and the way Jessica gently but firmly redirected her seating away from the center of the room. Ethan, a bright-eyed boy with his father's smile, had run to her when she arrived, hugging her tightly before being gently guided back by his mother. Jessica's smile at that moment had been polite, almost rehearsed, but her eyes had told a different story, one Margaret could not yet interpret. As the party progressed, Margaret tried to remain in the background, watching her grandson laugh with his friends, trying to ignore the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something she did not belong to anymore. The turning point came quietly, almost invisibly, when Margaret stepped forward during the cake cutting, leaning slightly to tell Ethan she was proud of him. It was a small gesture, a grandmother's instinct, but it was enough. Jessica's gaze sharpened instantly, her posture stiffening as she exchanged a quick look with someone near the entrance. Within seconds, the atmosphere shifted. The music seemed softer, the laughter more distant, and then came the moment no one expected. Jessica raised her hand slightly, and the security guards moved forward. Margaret looked around slowly, as if waiting for someone to explain a mistake, but instead she heard the words again, clearer this time, delivered with professional detachment. "Please step outside, ma'am." For a moment, Margaret did not move. Not because she was resisting, but because she was trying to understand how a room full of family, cake, and celebration could turn so cold in a single breath. Ethan's voice called out faintly from somewhere behind her, confused and uncertain, but Jessica's expression did not change. And as Margaret finally lowered her hands, still holding the small gift, she realized that whatever this day was meant to be, it was no longer hers to be part of in the way she once believed. Margaret slowly stepped forward as the security guards guided her away from the center of the celebration, her hands still gently holding the small wrapped gift as if it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the moment. Behind her, the sound of children laughing returned in uneven waves, almost pretending nothing had happened, while the soft music from the string quartet continued as though it had not been interrupted at all. The mansion hallway she was led into felt colder, quieter, and far removed from the warmth of the party she had entered only minutes earlier. One of the guards spoke politely but firmly, asking her to wait in a side corridor, and she nodded without resistance, her expression calm in a way that surprised even herself. Inside the main dining area, Jessica Parker remained perfectly composed, adjusting her posture as if nothing unusual had occurred, her attention already shifting back to the guests who were now exchanging uncertain glances. She lifted a glass of sparkling water and offered a small smile to a nearby guest, as though resetting the atmosphere with deliberate control. Yet beneath her calm exterior, there was a tension that only those closest to her seemed to notice, a quiet need to maintain order in a room that had just witnessed something uncomfortable. Ethan Parker, still holding a piece of birthday cake, looked toward the hallway where his grandmother had disappeared, his young face filled with confusion he did not know how to express. He tugged lightly on his mother's dress and asked where she had gone, but Jessica gently redirected his attention back to the celebration, her voice soft but firm, assuring him that everything was fine and that the party should continue. Meanwhile, in the quiet corridor, Margaret stood near a large window overlooking the garden, where sunlight fell across neatly trimmed hedges and rows of white roses swaying slightly in the afternoon breeze. She placed the small gift on a nearby table without opening it, as if deciding it belonged somewhere else now. Her thoughts moved slowly, not in anger, but in a steady attempt to understand how a day that began with warmth could shift so suddenly into distance. She remembered arriving early, carefully baking cookies in her small kitchen that morning, packing everything with care because she believed family gatherings always carried meaning beyond words. There was a time when Jessica had greeted her differently. She recalled faintly, a time when smiles felt genuine and conversations lasted longer than a few polite sentences. But over the past year, those moments had grown fewer, replaced by brief exchanges and carefully measured boundaries she had tried not to question. In the corridor, the hum of the celebration continued faintly through the walls, like a separate world that she was no longer fully part of, and yet she remained composed, standing with quiet dignity, as if waiting for something she could not yet name to unfold. The corridor remained still except for the distant echo of laughter drifting through the walls, a sound that felt increasingly disconnected from the space where Margaret Collins stood. She kept her posture straight, her hands gently folded in front of her, as though maintaining dignity was the only control she had left in a situation that had shifted without warning. The sunlight from the garden window stretched across the polished floor, highlighting the small wrapped gift she had placed on the side table, untouched and forgotten. Inside the main hall, the celebration continued with careful effort as guests tried to return to normal conversation, though their voices lacked the earlier ease. Jessica Parker moved through the room with practiced grace, speaking briefly with relatives and adjusting details of the event as if managing its rhythm could erase what had just occurred. She paused near the dessert table, offering polite smiles, yet her eyes occasionally drifted toward the hallway where Margaret had been taken, as if confirming that distance was being maintained. Ethan Parker sat near the birthday cake, now partially served, his attention divided between the ongoing celebration and the empty space where his grandmother had stood moments before. He asked quietly if she would come back, but his question was met with gentle deflection, and he slowly returned to his seat, uncertain but obedient to the flow of the moment. In the corridor, Margaret finally turned slightly toward the sound of the party, her thoughts steady but layered with quiet reflection. She remembered earlier years when birthdays were simpler, held in smaller homes with fewer decorations, but more laughter that felt genuine and unguarded. She thought of the effort she had made that morning, carefully selecting each ingredient for the cookies she brought, believing that such small gestures carried meaning that would always be understood. Now, standing apart from the room where her family gathered, she began to notice details she had once overlooked, subtle distances that had grown over time without confrontation. The way conversations softened when she entered, the way decisions were made without her input, and the way her presence had slowly become something that required adjustment rather than welcome. Jessica's voice carried faintly through the hallway, addressing guests with calm authority, maintaining the structure of the event as though nothing had disrupted it. There was no visible anger, only control, and that control extended into the atmosphere itself, shaping how others responded and moved. Margaret did not speak or interrupt, choosing instead to observe with a quiet clarity that replaced confusion. The moment no longer felt sudden to her, but instead part of a pattern she was only now beginning to recognize. As the afternoon light shifted through the garden window, she remained still, not as someone waiting to be called back, but as someone beginning to understand that what had changed was not the celebration itself, but her place within it. Inside the quiet corridor, the stillness around Margaret Collins deepened as the sounds of the celebration shifted into a distant, almost unreal background hum. She remained standing near the garden window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, blending with the soft colors of the afternoon light outside. The small wrapped gift still sat untouched on the side table, its presence becoming more symbolic with each passing minute, as if it represented a connection that was slowly being acknowledged as fragile. In the main hall, Jessica Parker continued moving through the event with controlled precision, ensuring that every detail of the birthday celebration remained visually perfect, from the arrangement of the dessert table to the timing of the cake service. Her conversations were brief but deliberate, her tone consistently polite, yet there was an underlying firmness in how she guided interactions, subtly directing the flow of attention away from anything that might disrupt the atmosphere she was maintaining. Ethan Parker sat with other children near the center of the room, his birthday crown slightly tilted, his energy quieter now as he occasionally glanced toward the hallway where his grandmother had been taken. When asked by another relative about his mood, he offered a small, uncertain smile, but his attention often drifted, suggesting that something about the day no longer felt entirely clear to him. Jessica noticed these glances and gently redirected him toward the activities, encouraging him to focus on the celebration, her voice calm and reassuring in a way that masked the complexity beneath her composure. Meanwhile, Margaret slowly turned away from the window and began to walk a few steps down the corridor, not with urgency, but with a steady and measured pace that reflected careful thought rather than reaction. Each step felt deliberate, as if she was no longer responding to the situation but observing it from a new distance. She recalled earlier moments in the day, from arriving at the mansion with a sense of purpose to the quiet changes in tone that had gradually unfolded around her presence. Those subtle shifts now formed a clearer pattern in her mind, one that she had not fully recognized while she was still inside the celebration. The way conversations softened when she entered a room, the way decisions seemed to be made without her awareness, and the way her role in the family had slowly transitioned from active participation to passive expectation. As she stood in the corridor, she realized that the events of the afternoon were not isolated, but connected to a longer progression she had once chosen not to question. Jessica's influence within the household was no longer just visible in moments of celebration, but embedded in the structure of how gatherings were managed and how relationships were quietly organized. Margaret did not express anger or confrontation. Instead, her silence carried a growing sense of recognition, as though she was finally seeing the full shape of a situation that had been forming over time. Outside the mansion, the garden remained bright and carefully maintained, its calm beauty contrasting with the layered tension inside. Inside, the celebration continued to function, but something fundamental had already shifted, not through words or actions alone, but through the quiet realization forming in the mind of the woman who now stood slightly apart from it all, understanding more than she had at the beginning of the afternoon. The atmosphere inside the mansion continued to maintain its outward appearance of celebration, yet beneath the polished surface, subtle shifts in behavior were becoming more noticeable to those who paid attention. Jessica Parker moved through the room with steady confidence, pausing occasionally to adjust small details that kept the event visually perfect, such as repositioning floral arrangements or guiding conversation flow between guests who seemed unsure of what to focus on. Her presence carried an unspoken authority that influenced how others behaved around her, even when she was not directly speaking. Ethan Parker remained seated with a group of children near the dessert table, his birthday hat slightly askew, his attention divided between the activity in front of him and the lingering absence of his grandmother. He asked a quiet question once more, not directed at anyone in particular, but it was gently redirected by an adult nearby who encouraged him to return to the celebration. He complied, though his expression suggested a lingering uncertainty that he did not yet understand how to articulate. In the quieter section of the house, Margaret Collins continued her slow movement down the corridor, each step measured and deliberate, as though she was giving herself time to process what had gradually become clear throughout the afternoon. She paused near another window overlooking the garden, where the sunlight had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the neatly trimmed landscape. The calm exterior of the estate contrasted sharply with the emotional complexity unfolding within it, creating a sense of separation between appearance and reality. Margaret's thoughts returned again to the earlier moments of the day, not with confusion, but with increasing clarity, as small details began to connect into a broader understanding of how her presence was being perceived within the household. The way conversations subtly adjusted when she entered a room, the way seating arrangements were quietly organized without her input, and the way decisions were made with gentle but firm direction all contributed to a pattern she could no longer ignore. There was no single moment she could point to as the beginning of this shift, only a gradual accumulation of small experiences that now formed a clear picture. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Jessica continued her careful management of the event, speaking briefly with guests and ensuring that the flow of the celebration remained uninterrupted. Her interactions were polite and controlled, yet always purposeful, guiding attention away from any lingering discomfort that may have arisen earlier. She occasionally glanced toward the corridor, not with visible concern, but with quiet confirmation that the situation remained contained. The guests, sensing the subtle tension, adapted their behavior accordingly, returning to conversations and focusing on the children's activities as the celebration proceeded. Margaret finally stopped walking and stood still for a moment, her posture composed, her expression calm, as she observed the distance between where she stood and where the celebration continued. She was no longer reacting emotionally to the situation, but instead observing it with a growing sense of understanding that felt steady and irreversible. The sound of laughter from the main room reached her faintly, softened by distance, and she realized that while the event itself had not changed, her connection to it had shifted in a way that could not easily be reversed. In that quiet moment, she remained present not as a participant in the celebration, but as someone beginning to fully recognize the boundaries that had been placed around her, whether spoken or unspoken, and what those boundaries now meant for her place within the family. The afternoon light outside the mansion continued to stretch across the garden in soft golden tones, but inside, the emotional temperature of the household had shifted into something quieter and more controlled. Margaret Collins stood near the end of the corridor now, her presence steady, her breathing calm, as though she had settled into a state of observation rather than participation. The faint sound of music and laughter still reached her from the main hall, but it no longer felt connected to her immediate reality. In her mind, the events of the day were no longer isolated moments, but parts of a sequence that had slowly revealed itself over time. She thought again about how she had arrived earlier that day, believing she was stepping into a familiar family celebration, and how each interaction since then had subtly redirected her sense of belonging. Meanwhile, inside the main hall, Jessica Parker continued to maintain the structure of the event with careful attention. She moved between guests with composed ease, ensuring that conversations remained light and that any discomfort from earlier moments was gently absorbed into the background of the celebration. When speaking to relatives, she maintained a consistent tone of warmth and clarity, reinforcing the idea that the event was proceeding exactly as planned. Ethan Parker remained near the center of the room, now engaged in a small group activity with other children, though his attention occasionally drifted toward the hallway where his grandmother had been taken earlier. His expressions were subtle and fleeting, but they reflected a curiosity that had not fully settled. When asked if he was enjoying the party, he nodded politely, though his responses carried a quiet hesitation that suggested his thoughts were divided. Jessica noticed his shifting attention and calmly guided him back into the present activity, ensuring that his focus remained on the celebration rather than the absence he had begun to notice. In the corridor, Margaret slowly adjusted her position, turning slightly so she could see more of the garden outside through the tall window. The view was peaceful, with trimmed hedges and soft movement from the breeze, yet her attention was no longer drawn to the scenery itself. Instead, she found herself reflecting on the gradual changes she had experienced within the family structure over time. She remembered how decisions that once involved open conversation had become quieter, how invitations felt less direct, and how her presence at gatherings had slowly shifted from central to peripheral without a single defining explanation. These realizations did not come with emotional urgency, but with a calm and steady clarity that made the patterns easier to recognize. Inside the main hall, Jessica briefly stepped toward the entrance area, where she exchanged a few words with staff members to confirm that everything remained in order. Her tone remained composed, and her demeanor suggested full control over the environment. She occasionally glanced toward the corridor, not with concern, but with quiet awareness that ensured the separation between spaces was being maintained. Guests continued their conversations, gradually settling back into the rhythm of the event, guided by the subtle reassurance of Jessica's presence. Margaret remained still, her posture unchanged, as she listened to the distant sounds of celebration blending into the background of the mansion. She no longer felt confusion about what was happening, but rather a growing understanding of how her role within the family had been quietly redefined over time. In that moment, standing between the quiet corridor and the distant sound of a celebration she was no longer fully part of, she began to see not just what had occurred earlier in the day, but what it represented in the broader context of her place within the family. Inside the mansion, the celebration had reached a stage where everything appeared carefully stabilized on the surface. Yet beneath that surface there was a quiet awareness among the adults that something had shifted earlier in the afternoon. Jessica Parker maintained her composed presence as she moved through the main hall, ensuring that guests remained comfortable and engaged, her tone consistent and her expressions carefully measured. She spoke briefly with relatives near the dessert table, acknowledging comments about the decorations and the children's activities, always guiding attention back toward the positive aspects of the gathering. Ethan Parker remained seated with a group of children, now participating in a small game organized by one of the family friends, though his focus occasionally drifted, his eyes moving toward the hallway where his grandmother had disappeared earlier. When gently prompted, he continued the activity, but there was a noticeable quietness in his responses, as though part of his attention remained elsewhere. Jessica observed this from a short distance, stepping in with calm reassurance, redirecting him toward the present moment with a steady and controlled tone that kept the atmosphere aligned with her intention for the event. In the corridor, Margaret Collins stood in the same general area near the window, her posture unchanged, her attention no longer focused on movement but on reflection. The garden outside remained bright and carefully maintained, with soft sunlight continuing to cast long shadows across the hedges, yet her interest was no longer in the scenery itself. Instead, her thoughts had become more structured, forming a clearer internal understanding of how the dynamics within the family had evolved over time. She recalled earlier years when her presence at gatherings was expected and welcomed without hesitation, and she contrasted those memories with the more recent experiences where her role had become less defined and more peripheral. These realizations did not come suddenly, but rather accumulated through small, consistent moments that she had previously chosen not to interpret too deeply. Inside the main hall, Jessica continued her subtle management of the environment, ensuring that conversations remained smooth and that the emotional tone of the celebration did not return to earlier discomfort. Her interactions with guests reflected a consistent sense of control, and even when speaking about light topics, there was a deliberate structure in how she guided responses. The staff assisting with the event followed her direction efficiently, adjusting small details to maintain the intended flow of the afternoon. Margaret slowly shifted her weight slightly, still near the window, as the distant sound of laughter continued to reach her through the corridor. She was no longer waiting for a return to the celebration, nor was she expecting an explanation to arrive from within it. Instead, she was processing the continuity of subtle changes that had led to this moment, recognizing that the situation she was experiencing was not the result of a single action, but of a gradual redefinition of space and belonging within the household. Ethan's voice briefly echoed from the main hall as he interacted with the other children, and although it was faint, it reached the corridor where Margaret stood. She did not move toward it, but she acknowledged it internally with quiet awareness. In that moment, she understood that the distance between herself and the ongoing celebration was no longer physical alone, but something that had developed over time into something more permanent and structured. The mansion remained bright, orderly, and filled with life, but within its quiet edges, Margaret stood with a growing sense of clarity about her position within it. The mansion continued to hold its carefully maintained atmosphere of celebration, but the emotional weight of earlier events had settled into a quieter, more persistent awareness among those who had witnessed the shift in tone. Jessica Parker remained composed in the main hall, moving with deliberate confidence as she ensured the continuity of the birthday event. Her interactions with guests were consistent and controlled, each exchange reinforcing a sense of stability that kept the gathering functioning smoothly. She checked briefly with staff near the dining area, confirming that the remaining activities would proceed according to schedule, her tone calm and authoritative without drawing attention to the adjustments being made in the background. Ethan Parker stayed with the other children, now engaged in a different activity involving small party games arranged near the living room area. Although he participated, there were moments when his attention drifted, his gaze moving toward the hallway in a way that suggested lingering curiosity about the absence he had not fully processed. When gently encouraged by adults around him, he returned to the activity without protest, though his expressions remained softer and more subdued than earlier in the day. Jessica noticed these subtle shifts and, with quiet precision, redirected his focus once more, ensuring that the rhythm of the celebration remained uninterrupted and that attention remained centered on the event itself. In the corridor near the garden window, Margaret Collins stood in stillness that had become more reflective than uncertain. The light outside had begun to change slightly, shifting from the warm intensity of midday toward the softer tones of late afternoon, casting longer and more defined shadows across the neatly arranged landscape. She observed this change without distraction, her thoughts no longer scattered but increasingly structured around a clear internal recognition of what the day had revealed to her. The earlier confusion she had felt had now been replaced by a calm and steady awareness of the patterns that had developed over time within the family dynamic. She considered the gradual nature of these changes, how they had not occurred through a single defining moment, but through a series of subtle adjustments in behavior, communication, and presence. Inside the main hall, the celebration continued to function with apparent normality, supported by Jessica's consistent guidance and the cooperative participation of guests who followed the tone she had set. Conversations remained light and socially appropriate, and the children's activities provided a steady background of movement and sound that kept the event visually and emotionally active. Yet within Margaret's perspective, there was a growing separation between the outward appearance of the celebration and her own position within it. She no longer interpreted her distance as accidental or temporary, but rather as part of a structured shift that had been forming gradually over time. Ethan's voice occasionally carried faintly through the open space of the mansion, blending with laughter and conversation. And while Margaret remained in the corridor, she acknowledged those sounds without attempting to move toward them. Her presence was no longer oriented toward participation, but toward observation and understanding. Jessica briefly glanced toward the corridor from the main hall, her expression unchanged, before turning her attention back to the guests, continuing her role in maintaining the balance of the event. Margaret remained near the window, her posture steady, her awareness fully engaged with the reality that the separation she was experiencing was no longer situational, but reflective of a deeper restructuring within the household. The mansion continued to shine with order and celebration, yet within its quieter edges, a clear and undeniable distance had formed, and Margaret stood within that space with complete recognition of what it meant. The late afternoon light had begun to soften across the mansion grounds, casting a warm but fading glow over the garden where everything appeared calm and carefully maintained. Inside the house, the birthday celebration for Ethan Parker continued with a steady rhythm, the sound of conversation and light laughter filling the main hall in a way that suggested normality had been restored after earlier moments of tension. Jessica Parker stood near the center of the room, her posture composed and her expression controlled as she engaged with guests in brief, polite exchanges that kept the event moving smoothly toward its conclusion. She gave subtle instructions to staff regarding the final stage of the celebration, ensuring that the cake cutting and closing moments would proceed without disruption. Ethan remained among the other children, now focused on a small group activity that had been organized to keep them entertained as the party neared its end. His behavior was calmer than earlier, though there were still brief instances when his attention drifted toward the hallway where his grandmother had been earlier in the day. When gently guided back into the activity by adults around him, he complied without resistance, though his expressions suggested a quiet uncertainty that had not fully resolved. Jessica observed him from a distance and maintained her calm guidance, ensuring that his focus remained on the present moment and the structure of the celebration. In the corridor near the garden window, Margaret Collins remained still, her presence steady and composed as she looked outward at the changing light. The garden outside had transitioned into softer tones, with shadows stretching longer across the carefully arranged landscape, signaling the approach of evening. She no longer felt the need to move or seek explanation, as her understanding of the day's events had settled into a clear internal recognition. The gradual shifts she had observed throughout the afternoon had formed a complete pattern in her mind, one that no longer required further validation from those inside the main hall. She thought about how her role within the family had changed over time, not through a single moment of rejection, but through a series of subtle adjustments that had slowly redefined her place within gatherings, conversations, and decisions. Inside the main hall, Jessica continued to oversee the final stages of the event with careful attention, ensuring that the atmosphere remained stable and that guests left with a positive impression of the celebration. Her movements were deliberate but unforced, reflecting a sense of control over both the environment and the emotional tone of the gathering. Occasional laughter from the children blended with soft music, creating a background that reinforced the appearance of a successful and well-managed event. Ethan's attention remained partially divided, though he continued to participate in the final activities, responding when prompted and following along with the group. Margaret remained near the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass as the interior lights of the mansion began to balance with the fading daylight outside. She did not attempt to re-enter the main hall, nor did she seek to re-establish her place within the ongoing celebration. Instead, she stood in quiet acceptance of the distance that had formed, recognizing it as something that had developed naturally over time. The mansion continued to function with its intended harmony, filled with structured activity and controlled warmth, yet within its quieter spaces, there remained a distinct separation that no longer required explanation. Margaret's understanding of that separation had become complete, and in that understanding, she remained steady, fully aware of her position within the family and the reality of what the day had revealed.